In this video, we're going to wrap up our discussion of government by going over two sections: government as the agency to protect rights, and statism as the politics of unreason. Stay tuned. So let's start out with a summary of both sections. So in the first section, we're talking about government as the agency that's going to protect rights. And the starting point is that, if our goal is to protect individual rights, we need an institution, an agency capable of protecting rights. And what a government is, it's an agent of self-defense. It holds a monopoly in the use of force in a given geographical area. And so what we're doing is we're delegating our right to self-defense to the government in order to bring the use of retaliatory force under objective control, i.e. under the control of objective laws. And we get then an account of what objective laws are. So they're clearly defined laws that aim at the protection of individual rights, and only the protection of individual rights. That's going to be the only function of a legal system and of a government. And this is important, yes, to stop criminals, but not only or even predominantly to stop criminals. We need it in order that non-criminals can resolve disputes peacefully. And what this amounts to in practice then is that a proper government, one that only protects rights, has three institutions, which is the police, the military, and the court system. And this we get then is all that government properly can do. And the way that Leonard puts it is, the power of force is the power of destruction, not creation, and it must be used accordingly, i.e., only to destroy destruction. For a society to inject that power into any creative realm, spiritual or material, is a lethal contradiction. It is the attempt to use death as a means of sustaining life. And so this means that intellectual freedom is sacrosanct. So it's no government involvement in education, art, science, sex, assuming that it's adult and voluntary, or philosophy. And another quote from Leonard here is, "The right to think and act as one chooses necessarily includes the right to choose incorrectly, whether through ignorance or evasion, and then to suffer the consequences. An individual free to choose only what the government authorizes is correct has no freedom. A proper government is based on a definite philosophy, but it can play no role in promoting that philosophy." And so then there's another area where intellectual freedom is sacrosanct, and that's the realm of economic freedom. And so it's, quoting Leonard again, "The state must not undertake to provide men with economic standards or benefits, whether in regard to goods, services, or conditions of trade. A proper government offers freedom from coercion, including fraud, not from the responsibility of self-sustenance. It protects men from thieves, swindlers, and killers, not from reality or the need to create one's values by one's own mind and labor." And so this is what it means for a government to be a servant rather than a master. It's that a proper government is not a democracy which just enacts the will of the mob. It's a republic, and its power comes from the consent of the government, but the governed. But the consent isn't whatever people decide to consent to. It's not arbitrary. What we consent to is to delegate the powers that we morally hold, i.e. the power of self-defense. And so Leonard wraps this section up by saying the source of a government's power is not arbitrary consent, but rational consent based on an objective principle. The principle is the rights of man. So that's the positive. That's what we need government properly to do. But of course, governments can do many things that aren't proper. And so then we get an account of the opposite of a government that protects rights, statism, a system in which government is violating the rights of the individual. And so the way that Leonard defines it is, statism means any system that concentrates power in the state at the expense of individual freedom. And so he wants to tie this to the deepest roots in philosophy, that statism is actually anti-reason. And we get a bit of a historical account of the way in which, if you go back to Marx and things, statism was cloaked in the language of science. We had scientific socialism. It's based on reason and logic, i.e., although it's quote, dialectical logic. And what ends up happening is that socialism and all of its variants fail. And so what do the statists do? Do they go, well, that didn't lead to prosperity. That doesn't seem very rational anymore. I guess we need to embrace capitalism. No, it's that they discard reason. They discard even the pretense at being scientific. And this is the whole phenomenon of the New Left, where it says, all right, no more pretending to be pro-reason, no more pretending to be pro-technology, no more pretending to be pro-progress and pro-prosperity. So the way Ayn Rand eloquently sums it up is she says, confronted with the choice of industrialized civilization or collectivism, it is an industrial civilization the liberals discarded. Confronted with the choice of technology or dictatorship, it is technology that they discarded. Confronted with the choice of reason or whims, it is reason that they discarded. And then we get, well, you might think that the opposite of statism is anarchism, and that they're the most consistent opponents of statism because they're saying, let's not have a state. But in practice, what anarchy amounts to and has to amount to, we get, is that it's gang warfare and gang rule. As such, it is what Leonard calls an unusually senseless form of statism. It is not an extreme of freedom, but a negation of the concept. And so it's not a rights protecting government that's kind of a middle ground between statism and anarchy. Rather, there is a middle ground between freedom and control, or freedom and statism, but it's the mixed economy. And that, like what exists today across most of the globe, and certainly in the West, where we're going to mix some freedom and some controls. And Leonard notes that the mixed economy obviously rests on the philosophy of pragmatism and thus in subjectivism. So it too is a form of rule by unreason. But so it's portrayed as this mixture, this middle of the road, but because the mixed economy throws out the principle of individual rights, since individual rights are, okay, you can have some of them unless the public welfare requires the government to violate your rights, what that means in effect is that human beings exist not by right, but by permission of society or God. And ultimately, this means that a mixed economy is not, as Leonard puts it, a third way between capitalism and socialism. It is merely a transition stage, a disintegrating anti-system careening drunkenly but inexorably from freedom to dictatorship. And finally, we get then an account of two intellectual forces driving the development of the mixed economy, at least in the United States, but in certain ways in other countries, liberals and conservatives. And we get that, the liberals are definitely like all in on statism, but that from the objectivist perspective, the conservatives, and now remember, OPAR is written in 1992, so this is pre-Trump, but he says the conservatives are more dangerous because of their pretense at upholding free enterprise and the American system. So in other words, the argument is going to be, yeah, there's more that is on its surface appealing and pro-capitalism and pro-freedom among conservatives, but that's actually what's going to make them worse and more dangerous and more destructive to the cause of freedom. So Leonard puts it this way. Since they purport to be fighting big government, they are the main source of political confusion in the public mind. They give people the illusion of an electoral alternative without the fact. Historically, from the Sherman Act to Herbert Hoover to the Bush administration, it is the conservatives, not the leftists, who have always been the major destroyers of the United States. And then the kind of coda to all that is that objectivists are not conservatives. We're radicals for reason and therefore radicals for capitalism. So let's step back and see what we're trying to do in this section and these sections, and indeed this whole chapter. And in fact, let's even go wider than that. Like, we've seen that what a moral life is for objectivism. It's one that's aimed at self-preservation and happiness, achieved by living rationally. And so then the question is, what's the best way for people to live together? And it's that, yeah, other people are a value, but even wider than that, society is a value. Living in a human society is a tremendous value, that we benefit not just from like occasional personal relationships, but we benefit from living among thousands and millions and billions of other people, above all because of the values of knowledge and trade. But other people can also be threats, and we've seen this throughout the section on ethics, but particularly highlighted when we talked about the initiation of force as wrong. That when it comes to force, there's a kind of threat people can pose that involves not just kind of like emotionally disappointing us or anything like that. It's that they render our ability to live rationally impossible, at least insofar as they successfully use force against us. And so that if we want a society that helps rather than hinders our ability to live rationally, what we need, the single thing that has to be our focus, is extracting force from human affairs. That's the meaning then of subordinating might to right. It's that you can pursue what's right because might is only used in the name of right. And that, as we saw with the whole analysis of individual rights, that doesn't mean to enforce what's right, that you can't do that. You can't force the good on anybody. But what individual rights do is protect the right way of living, the ability to live rationally, and say nobody can interfere with that through force. And if they do, then we have a moral right to retaliate with force. So then how do we extract force from human affairs? So if that's our goal, if that's what's required in order to have a society where people can live rationally, how do we actually achieve that? And so the first thing we need is to identify a method for what counts as initiating physical force. And as I just indicated, and as we've talked about last time, it's not always obvious what force is, that we need the principle of individual rights to define the sphere of freedom that morally we should have, the kinds of choices we should be able to make independently. And then we say, all right, if somebody interferes with that physically, by physical means, that constitutes the initiation of physical force, and that's out. So then how do you respond when somebody initiates force? It has to be retaliatory force. It has to be self-defense. And so you might think, well, then why isn't the answer to the proper way to organize society? Well, we just all go about our business, and if somebody uses force against us, we just use force against them back. So if somebody robs me, then I go and take back my property. And if somebody kills me, I guess I just kill them right back. Or presumably, I have my wife or somebody to do it. And obviously part of the answer is that's pretty inefficient. If somebody steals my car, I don't want to spend hours a day not doing my work and going about my life in order to track it down. And even if I did do that, what if I get there and the guy's 6'5" and armed to the teeth? So I probably want to delegate my right to self-defense. And I don't want to delegate it even to one person. Even if I know Jack Reacher, I'd probably rather have Jack Reacher and a bunch of other people so that I ensure that my side prevails if there's a conflict. And so you want to have a group of specialists who are sure to overpower the bad guys. But is that enough? Would that really extract force from human affairs if you just basically said, all right, my Jack Reacher gang is ready to go out there and protect my rights? Well, just play the tape forward a little bit. So suppose my car is stolen and I conclude that, Bill Murray took it. So I go to my Jack Reacher defense organization and I say, hey, let's go to Bill Murray's house, beat the hell out of him, and take back my car. And assume that we're really diligent, right? I didn't just invent this out of whole cloth. I caught a guy who looks very much like Bill Murray on camera. I got one of those, stars maps to the home of the stars. And we get there and there's a car that looks like mine, and we even checked the VIN number, and we are not being capricious. We have every reason to think that Bill Murray took my car and we're going to get it back. But now Bill Murray's neighbors look out and they see us smacking Bill around and taking a car from his driveway. From their perspective, what is going on? There's a gang walking around and beating the crap out of people and taking their property. Well, they have every reason to fear that they're next. The threat of force is force. That's one of the things we've talked about here. And so in taking back my property in this manner, I'm actually initiating force against third parties. They have every reason to think that there's this crazy gang that could be attacking them. We can integrate that with our discussion of the arbitrary. Remember, it's possible for an idea to be arbitrary for me, even if it's not arbitrary for you. If you went through the processing, if you saw certain kind of evidence, then something can be objective to you, but socially it's arbitrary until I have, or at least have the ability to go through that evidence. So even if I know in my own mind that my actions against Bill are retaliatory, from the perspective of third parties, I'm using force arbitrarily. I haven't made objective to them that this is an act of self-defense, and so it is a threat to them. So that's the kind of problem we have. The problem that we're having is that we're trying to extract force from human affairs, and yet it seems that if we go around trying to defend ourselves, in many cases, if not most cases, now we're terrorizing third parties. So, and that doesn't even get into the idea of like, what if I haven't been quite so diligent, or what if there's some ambiguity, like it's kind of a guy who looks like Bill Murray, but I can't find my car. Like, at what point do I have the right to beat the crap out of him? You know? So it's, how do we solve this problem? And what it comes down to is that we need an institution that protects all of us, so that it's not just a gang that's favoring some people at the expense of others. It's not just my group doing my bidding. They have just as much of an interest in protecting Bill from force, protecting his neighbors from force. And that we all then, in principle, have the same amount of control over this institution that's going to do the beating up, as it were. And so then we need that shared institution that we all have a stake in, we all have equal control over, that's all invested in protecting all of us. And then we need that institution to make the use of force, to make its use of retaliatory force objective. So what does that mean? Well, it means we need to know exactly when it's going to use force. That is, we need to know precisely what is forbidden and have confidence that as long as we don't do those things, force won't be used against us. We need to know the general procedures that will be followed to determine when someone has done something that's forbidden. And then, so that's kind of like, we need to know the general procedures that a court system is going to have to follow to conclude, yeah, you're guilty. And then we need to know, we need to at least be able to know, if we're interested, that those procedures are being followed. So it's not just the institution announcing Bill Murray's a criminal, so we've locked him up for a decade. It's, we can all see the evidence that led to the conclusion that, yes, Bill was a criminal, and if we have that, then that makes objective, yes, this was really an act of self-defense. This was really an act of retaliation. And then finally, we need to know what the punishment will be, not necessarily in the specifics, but we need to have a general sense of, if you violate this rule, if you violate this law, if you do what's forbidden, this is the kind of consequence. Because if it's just whatever a judge happens to decide, and it could be a $100 fine or the death penalty, you have now still force being used at the arbitrary discretion, at the whim of individuals. And to put force under objective control means nobody's arbitrary whim can decide when it's used, against whom, and how. We all have to have confidence that it's being used objectively, because we know the rules and can assess independently whether they're being followed. So that's then the kind of basis for a proper government. It's why we need a proper government. It's what constitutes the kind of government that is extracting force from human affairs. Just briefly then, so that would be a proper government, right? But we can think of statism as, all right, we've got this institution that has, control over the use of force, but instead of extracting force, it resorts to the arbitrary use of force. It's not bound by individual rights. And part of Rand's analysis of the nature of statism is that it's precisely the goal of the people in power, not to be bound by the rule of law, to be able to use force by their whim, to impose their will on other people. So it's not just that the government will punish you for things that you should be free to do. Like, that's bad, but if you just had like laws against smoking marijuana or laws saying you needed a license to practice medicine, like, people can cope with that. But statism ultimately means that the people in power can use force arbitrarily. You don't know what's forbidden. You don't know when force will be used against you. You don't know how it will be used, and you have nothing. There's nothing you can do in order to protest. And so you can think of that then as we're trying to solve two problems. The problem of, there is no institution to bring force under objective control, or, that institution is using force arbitrarily. And so that's really what's being solved by the objectivist analysis of what a proper government is. So I want to turn then to what we can think of as a new perspective on freedom that we get, or at least it's, if you can put it as new, or it's distinctive. It certainly has its roots in how the Enlightenment figures thought about freedom. But you could say that the conventional view is that we give up some of our natural freedom in exchange for becoming part of society. The idea is that, like, we're born free, and then it's, well, if you want to join society, you got to surrender some of that freedom. And notice that way of thinking about freedom, as in effect, it's the freedom in nature to do whatever the hell you want, and you got to give up some of that to join society. This really lays the groundwork for statists who say, well, hey, becoming part of society, you got to give up some of your freedom, and so we're going to extract a whole hell of a lot of it. You have to obey a whole raft of regulations. You have to hand over your money to the welfare state. Maybe, that means that we inherit this power of eminent domain and can take your house whenever somebody who's going to pay more taxes wants to build a shopping mall. From the objectivist view, freedom is a political concept. It arises in a context of distinguishing between different kinds of societies and their government. It's a society where force has been extracted from human affairs versus a society where force is used at whim. And so from that perspective, there is no issue of you're surrendering your freedom by joining society. It's, in fact, an expansion of freedom, if you want to think about it that way. Because even if we think about, what do you have in a state of nature? It's not, this glorious, like, nothing ever interferes with me. It's any person you run into is a total threat, and unless you can fend them off through your own, fists or tree branch, you're a goner. And so the idea is that with a proper government, you're much safer when we have a government that's protecting rights than you would be if you just had to defend yourself in a state of nature. And so freedom means freedom from force, because freedom from force is what's required in order to live rationally. Freedom from the objectivist perspective doesn't mean the ability to do whatever you feel like doing, and then, I guess you have to give some of that up when other people come along and say, no, you've gone too far. And one of the things we're going to see in a little bit is the way in which that's really what anarchists take freedom to mean. It's, I want to use retaliation whenever I decide it's fine, or I want my gang to retaliate in my name because I feel like it. And if you won't let me start my own defense agency, i.e. my own gang, then you're taking away my freedom. From the objectivist perspective, no, you don't have that freedom, because that makes you a threat to other people. That freedom is force being extracted, and that, as we've seen, depends on a government that has a stake in the freedom of all the people in society. Nor, I want to underline, does freedom on the objectivist view mean freedom from reality's demands. Like this idea of a hungry man is not free, and all of these varieties. You'll get some version of, hey, how can you say that you're free when your boss can tell you to work 50 or 60 hours a week and you can't get another job, allegedly? That is, like, that's not freedom. But from the objectivist view, it is freedom. And, part of the testament that there is a big difference between a system that keeps you free from force and one that doesn't. In other words, if the argument is, yeah, freedom's not a value if you're hungry, the testament to the fact that no, if you're protected from force, even if you're hungry, freedom is a huge value, is the very fact that in the era before the welfare state, immigrants flocked here. They knew that being able to engage, to chart their own path and really try to make a life for themselves was a tremendous value that they did not have at home. And so there is no, to say that someone isn't free because human beings have to produce in order to achieve values is to say, in other words, that, okay, what real freedom would be is forcing others to work for you. It's that kind of like contradictory position that the only coherent concept of freedom can be not freedom from the demands of reality, but freedom from force. And that's what a government that protects rights establishes. It's also important that freedom from objectivism is a unity. And so there's not like these kind of isolated freedoms that one could have on their own, and government only took away 4 of my freedoms. At least I have like 37 other, often it will be put in terms of liberties, right? Well, I have my 10 favorite liberties, but unfortunately I lost the other 20. It's that though you can abstract elements or aspects of freedom intellectually, so you can think of intellectual freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, that in reality they're total. And this is really important in terms of thinking about property rights. So often what you would get, and even today you still get, is that socialists will portray themselves as, no, we're for the freedom of human beings, we're for the liberty of human beings, and we're anti-property rights. And we think that property rights are, hold people in bondage precisely because they impose, from their perspective, what property rights really amount to is the imposing on people the need to support their own lives, right? From the objectivist perspective, freedom means, or rather, property rights are the precondition of every other right. They're the precondition of having freedom, because freedom means the ability to live rationally. And if you recall our discussion of reason as man's basic means of survival, living rationally is not about just thinking as an end in itself, but using your mind to guide your actions, especially using your mind to produce the values you need to survive. So you cannot act according to your judgment unless you have a right to property. Without the right to property, you're taking orders from whomever controls that property. They're telling you what you can do. They're disposing the values you create, so that actual freedom is a total and indivisible unity of economic and political freedom, or rather intellectual freedom. It's the ability to use your mind and then use that to guide your life, including by creating values which then nobody can seize from you. And so what I'm trying to stress here is that freedom isn't a default state. It's a real achievement, and it comes from establishing a rights-protecting government, a government that extracts force from human affairs. One issue that is sometimes confusing is that both Rand and Peikoff say that a proper government is based on the consent of the governed, and that we consent to delegate our right of self-defense to the government. And so there's a question of the right way to think about consent, because anarchists love to push on this point. They're like, you never got my consent. And the typical response to that is usually, well, you gave some tacit form of consent by choosing to enter society or something like that. You choose to live here and that means you consent. But for objectivism, that's not the issue. So remember the piece I quoted by Leonard. The source of a government's power is not arbitrary consent, but rational consent based on an objective principle. The principle is the rights of man. So the issue is rational consent. It's that if you're rational, you would consent to this, and that at some point you really did need rational people, specific rational people, to say, this is a rational form of government to which we do consent, to establish that kind of government. But once you have that, then it's that government has the moral authority to protect the rights of all of the people in that geographic area. It's not like they need to get them to sign a piece of paper. In the Blackwell Companion, Fred Miller and Adam Mossoff put it this way, and I'm going to quote sort of extensively because I found it really clarifying on this point. She, Rand, understands the consent of the governed in a very strict sense. Quote, now they're quoting Rand, there is only one basic principle to which an individual must consent if he wishes to live in a free, civilized society. The principle of renouncing the use of physical force and delegating it to the government, his right of physical self-defense, for the purpose of an orderly, objective, legally defined enforcement. They go on to say, hence, government is an agent of its individual citizens with specific and clearly delimited powers. Rand does not, however, subscribe to the social contract theory, according to which individuals allegedly consent, either actually or hypothetically, to the authority of government. For Rand, the delegation of rights is a moral requirement for rational individuals, not an actual claim about assent to a particular institution or government. And later they say, she does not view the consent of the government as the standard for determining the proper functions of government. So it's not like, what's proper for government to do? Whatever people happen to consent to. Continuing the quote, she maintains that the government has no legitimate powers except those delegated to it for the specific purpose of protecting the rights to life, liberty, and property. So, I mean, what does this mean in practice? It means that, like, there's a group of rational people who set up a government protecting their rights, and any other rational person will consent to the delegation of that power of self-defense, because that's what's required in order to be able to pursue their interests. That's what's required in order to extract force from human society. Now, you can be irrational. You can declare, I don't consent. That's fine. But the issue is, if you resort to force, if you decide to compete with the government by acting as judge, jury, and executioner, you've made yourself a threat to the rational people whose rights the government is protecting. And so when the government stops you, you don't have any grounds for saying that your rights are being violated. No, you are threatening the rights of the people who are properly consenting and delegating their right to self-defense to the government. And so that then helps us see and make clear, which should hopefully be clear by now, the objectivist rejection of anarchy. So we need force to be placed under objective control, and that requires a government, and that competing with the government, what that means is saying, no, I'm not going to appeal to an impersonal institution to protect everyone's rights, but me and my gang are going to act as judge, jury, and executioner. Well, that is the socially arbitrary use of force. And it's totally irrelevant in that context whether in your own mind, yeah, we're really going to go through and make sure that we're diligent about only retaliating. And so I think all that has been established, but what I'm really, the only new point that I want to highlight under anarchism is this point that Leonard makes, that it's not an extreme view of freedom. It's not like they take freedom too far, but as Leonard puts it, a senseless form of statism. That when people can unilaterally deploy force, what you have is gang warfare. And another way to think about that is that anarchy is not some utopian theory, and who knows what would happen if we tried it. Like, we've had plenty of examples of the resort to gang warfare and people saying, yeah, I unilaterally want to impose my will on others. You can think of Somalia or parts of Los Angeles, at least at certain times, where you had roving gangs and that the actual government was not protecting rights in those areas. you can think of the mafia and communities where it's shaking people down all the time. Or if you remember the recent riots in Oregon and the so-called free zones in the city that were taken over by strongmen. That's what competition, quote unquote, enforce is. And that's why talking about competition, competing defense agencies, is wrong. To draw any sort of parallel between that and free markets, between competing in force and competing in production, is insane. You can't equate competition in production with competition in destruction. It's two fundamentally different kinds of activities. You can't use the language of voluntary transactions to describe involuntary activities any more than you can use the language of involuntary activities to describe voluntary activities, which is the whole issue with, language that is used with business all the time of, they're crushing the competition and they're robber barons and all of that garbage. It's that, no, we have to have a unbreached distinction between freedom and force, and that all of the attempt to apply market terminology to the use of force is blurring that distinction. So that's all I wanted to cover in these sections, and that's all that we're going to be covering in this chapter. Next, we're going to turn to capitalism, and we will then be within spitting distance of the end of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. So be sure to like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and as always, the best way to stay in touch is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk next time.